So what I'm going to cover today is essentially a summary of the key ideas that I cover in some of my teaching at INSEAD. So INSEAD is a business school, but as we know, increasingly impact is a topic that's happening not just in the social sector, but more broadly across sectors, including in the business world. It's a very important topic, both in terms of, addressing the challenges we face in society today, and also in business, also as an opportunity, because unless business thinks seriously about issues around impact, there isn't that much future even for them as a business, the way the things are going, let's say on the environmental side, the social side, issues of equality, poverty, and all of that. And now certainly COVID highlights a lot of those issues. So I'm going to start with this, quote from Mahatma Gandhi, which is, happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony. And this is something that we see in the business world as well, which is people generally are more and more dissatisfied in purely traditional business careers where the only goal is focusing on money, and they're asking, what is my life about? How do I contribute to society? And certainly this is becoming a big issue, especially in the new generation. And so this is a very important conversation to have across the society, including in business schools. Now, a lot of times what happens in the business world when people are working in large companies and so on, and they're feeling they're not sufficiently connected to society, they would do things like volunteering on the weekends, or take a few days off, or participate in a corporate social responsibility program where a few employees, go as a team. And, this is an example of one of those projects where I went to Cambodia on a house building trip. Now, in principle, this is a nice way to connect with the world, to learn about a world that we might not normally know about. And, this was about building houses for rural communities, hours away from the big cities. But at the same time, one could question how much impact a person like me would have. Because if you look at me struggling with the hammer there, this really is not my skill. It is not even clear that the house I'm building is worth living. And I'm almost sure that somebody came the day after I left to actually clean up all the mess that I made. So this was an opportunity, for team building, certainly for my son to learn more about Cambodia and about global issues. He's in the picture at the bottom right, but not the best way for me necessarily to have impact per se. But, this is a start, but we have to keep things in perspective. Now, some people get bolder in corporate jobs, and this is a very inspiring book that John Wood, who quit Microsoft, wrote. It's called Leaving Microsoft to Change the World, and he went on to form one of the largest education nonprofits, which is called Room to Read. And in this particular case, he went on to build a very successful one, which is not your average case, because typically if somebody is leaving a corporate job going to a nonprofit, there are obviously questions you could ask about, are they well suited? Do they understand what the issues are? Is this really the best way for them to contribute in all of that? So the point that, we are coming back to, and we see this in the conference, we see this in my teaching, is that very often in the past, we've thought about these as completely two different worlds. There's a world of business where you make money, and then there's the world of impact, for example, nonprofits, volunteering, and so on. And these two worlds are increasingly coming together, right? So it's no longer just a conversation about, hey, in the day I go work on my job, and in the evening I do something that's aligned with my values and I feel I'm giving back. People are saying, how do I lead a meaningful career where I'm able to combine the two? And so the key question that has to be asked in that context is not whether you're working in a nonprofit or a for-profit or a social enterprise or a impact investing company and so on, but really how much difference are you making? And I like to use this very simple definition that in the end, despite all the jargon around impact and impact measurement and all of that, if you really come to the crux, impact is ultimately about saying, how is the society different because you're a part of it? Whether you as an individual, you as a team, you as an organization, you as a project. But the question to ask is, how would the world be different if I didn't exist? And you're hoping that you are making a lot of positive difference. And that's really what it is about, thinking rationally about how much is that difference, rather than just feeling good about, hey, I'm going building houses or I'm volunteering and all of that. Those are just activities you're conducting, but that doesn't necessarily always translate into a positive difference that you make on the world. And to take a specific example of that, which I really like to make this point, about this distinction between good intentions that you might have, which is fantastic, but are they really translating into actual impact? I quote this very interesting short study that somebody did a while ago in the UK, where there were a couple of paragliding centers which were offering newcomers an opportunity to participate at very reasonable prices. And just for people to get over this fear of jumping from planes, they said, hey, and all money that we will go to charity. So it got a lot of new people excited. They signed on, but somebody said, let's see exactly what it achieved. So in this case, across 2 centers over a few years, 1,500 people skydived, and they raised 120,000 pounds, which, it's something. Now, skydiving is a expensive sport. So given that the jumps were being paid from the cost, there was only a part of it that was left for actual charitable causes. So 45,000 pounds in this case. And you say, okay, well, that's still something. Isn't something better than nothing? And in this case, actually turns out nothing might have been better than something, because a lot of these people were not well trained in jumping out. Proper procedures were not being followed. So even though they raised 45,000 pounds, many of them got injured, some of them very seriously, so that the UK's health system ended up paying 610,000 pounds in public money for repairing their broken bones. And now you realize that for every dollar being raised, about $15 was spent by a society. So this, if these numbers are even close to correct, this would be an example in which there were some really well-intentioned people participating in the initiative, but the impact was certainly negative rather than positive. And the irony of that is a lot of the money raised was actually being raised for the local hospitals, which were repairing these bones. So this, very simple example does illustrate a broader point that I think is much more general and comes up again and again in the social impact space, whether you think of businesses, corporate social responsibility, social enterprises, and nonprofits, which is what outcomes are we actually enabling? What are we achieving? What is the cost effectiveness of achieving that? And are there any unintended consequences we really haven't thought about? So this is, a very rational way of going about it. So rather than just saying, hey, we are all nice people, we want to help the world, so let's, congratulate everybody who tries to do anything good. I think for sure, passion is a fantastic place to start. And I'm a big believer that intentionality to have a positive impact rather than purely being driven by business reasons makes a huge difference. At the same time, I think we have to be as rigorous and critical about models to have impact as we have for models to have business. In Silicon Valley, the VC firms are notorious for all the tough questions they ask, because if you can survive those questions, you become better. And much more of that needs to happen in the social sector as well. That's my view. And so in particular, when you're thinking, okay, how do I make a positive difference? I think you shouldn't jump at the first thing that looks good in terms of, hey, isn't this great? Here's an opportunity. I'm giving back to society this way. But you step back and ask these 3 questions. What really is a need? Is this an important need that I can contribute to? Is there even a real need? And the second is, who am I to contribute here? Am I really able to bring a unique aspect of of my skills here. And the third, of course, is your broader goals. It's not just about impact. It could be you have your own financial constraints, your family constraints, time constraints. But in the end, you really have to bring all of these three together and ideally look for a sweet spot where you can combine your skills with a real need and operate within your ambition as well as the constraints in which you're operating in here. So I like to, when talking about impact, structure the discussion very often in my presentations around this very simple framework that recently Impact Management Project has come up with, because this is a language that's being used by a lot of people when they're talking about impact. So the starting point is a recognition that, reducing impact to one number that would work everywhere and have a currency of, this is better than that. It's very ambitious. People are working on it, but there are ethical dilemmas and some serious theoretical issues around it. But at a minimum, when we're talking about impact, we should talk about it in the same way, right? And that's the spirit of the Impact Management Project, which is it breaks impact down into 5 questions. The questions are, what are you trying to achieve? Who are you trying to serve? How much difference would you actually make? What really is your unique contribution versus what would have happened anyway? And finally, are there any risks of failing or even having some unintended consequence and harm from your project? So I'm going to, run through some examples just to make these 5 concepts a little bit more real, because it's useful to think about them in depth. The first is, what outcomes are you seeking? And this is in line with a lot of conversations we saw in yesterday, which is historically a lot of times the focus has been how much money are we spending, how much do we give away to CSR, or even what activities are we doing. Look, we have our loan officers going to the field, we have our after school trainers going to schools and so on. Or outputs is, how many kids showed up in our program, and, how many lessons did we run, how many hours of training did we conduct. But ultimately, it's about outcomes, which is how much did we contribute in terms of what is the change that we want to see in society. So just to reflect on why this actually ends up throwing people off is very often people start with solutions rather than problems. And a classic case of this is a 1 laptop per child. And this happens all the time also. More recently, let's send Wi-Fi to villages. Let's give everybody a laptop. Let's give everybody access to a tablet. Let's bring 3G, 4G, 5G, and it's going to all solve all the problems. And the reality is technology is just an enabler, but you still need to think about how technology is leading to meaningful outcomes. In this particular case, there are academic studies which show that this 1 laptop per child project actually ended up, despite all the hype, really not delivering that much in learning outcomes. So to the extent that the objective of giving every child a laptop is that they are better at learning, if that fundamental thing is not realized, you ask, hey, why did we even do this project? So the other example, which is slightly more subtle, is maybe you are achieving some, pursuing some outcomes that you're clear about, but how important are they? Are they really a big deal? And an example of that as a business. So a case study for, integrating business and impact very often that gets taught is Tom's, which is a company that at some point was valued at about 800 million. The whole idea was we will have this buy one, give one business model. So somebody buys a pair of Tom shoes, and some poor kid in a poor country, and India was one of the countries that they worked with, would get access to a free pair of shoes. So the consumers feel really good about themselves. So this is another of those ideas of good intentions, but the good intentions are now more on the consumer side. On, look, I'm making a positive difference. Whenever I buy a pair of shoes, some kid somewhere gets helped. But then, again, a lot of people did in-depth study, and they realized, shoes are certainly not among the top 20 needs in most communities, even poor communities. There's a lot more basic things they're struggling with. Second, just giving away is creating a culture of dependence. And the third is the kind of marketing messages that, especially in the early years, Tom's was giving on, look, everybody in the villages is so poor, they don't have shoes and all of that. That almost creates a negative impression of life of a lot of people, and portrays them as permanently dependent rather than somebody who can take control of their life. So Tom's itself then moved on actually subsequently to change its position. But this was another of those examples on this sort of had an outcome in mind, but that was just a outcome that was coming more from, I can sell shoes in a way that I'll give shoes to somebody, rather than starting with what do they really need? And are there really a lot of people that have this need? Which goes to the next question, which is, who are you serving in the first place, right? And example here, this is a picture from I took in Myanmar when I was visiting a microfinance organization there. And microfinance very often, to people who are outside the sector, gets told as this story where, oh, is this wonderful sector, and all microfinance organizations are social enterprises and all they care about is impact. But the reality is there's an entire spectrum of organizations. There are some organizations that really are just operating as hardcore businesses purely to make money. And then there's others that genuinely care about impact. And very often, one of the things you notice when you look across those is the people that they serve and how they serve are very different. There's a difference between serving somebody who's making $10 a day and somebody who's making $2 a day. There's a difference between serving somebody who already has access to 5 loans and you're the one who's going in trying to sell the 6th loan, versus you're doing something where you're bringing in, genuine inclusion. You're the first person there bringing access to finance. There's a difference between just pushing your loan products versus actually saying, you know what, in this community, insurance is the challenge. In this community, savings needs to be encouraged. In this community, financial literacy is where we need to start. So again, once you start unpacking exactly who are you serving and how are you serving, you start noticing that what looked like one big black box is actually very different in terms of the potential for having impact. And this is borne out by a lot of academic studies. So this is a picture that I have from the preventive healthcare space. And the summary of this picture is that across a lot of preventive healthcare causes, in this case, it's about deworming, which is shown to improve school performance, access to bed nets, which is shown to reduce malaria-related deaths, water disinfectant, which is shown to reduce diarrhea-related deaths, and so on. Actually, even slight increases in price very often price out big segments of the market. And that's why I think the point here is to say, on the one hand, business models are a great opportunity to serve the poor. They bring in a sense of dignity and choice to them. At the same time, there is still a room for concessionary models, non-profit models, government-funded models, because business models will be able to reach certain segments and they will not be able to serve other segments. And in the end, we want to, as a society, make sure everybody is served and all important issues such as sustainable development goals are appropriately dealt with. And business models indeed are an important part of doing it, but they cannot be the whole story. Another example, challenges with business models is a story that Impact Investor had told me a few years ago, which is they had invested in a chain of inclusive cafes in Southeast Asia. This was Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. And the whole idea was that they would bring in as employees women that have been exploited. Very often these are women who've suffered sexual assault. These are women that have been trafficked and so on. So really, really, that have gone through a lot of pain in life. But one of the challenges that they faced was that, yes, we bring them in, but sometimes it's just harder to integrate them into business. Sometimes the customers react negatively and so on. So the tension they had was, how do you scale up this model? How do you make it financially viable? And in this case, they ended up making a choice of to make sure that you stay profitable, you have to broaden your definition of inclusion to include not just extreme cases, but also a lot of moderate cases of slightly disadvantaged people, people coming from poor communities, handicapped people, and so on. Now, those are, of course, important issues as well, and important communities as well. But the point is, you end up making a choice sometimes in a model that seems like a win-win model, but you're realizing that you really wanted to serve a particular segment, the most extreme segment, but then you could not scale it up within that segment because the business model didn't work, right? So, and this is the point, which is very often when you look at a lot of these win-win business models and you double click, you see there are dilemmas and tensions. So yes, surely there's room to build business models where you can help disadvantaged people. But then again, there might be people in more extreme circumstances that might not be easy to serve through business models that are as profitable as the other ones. And it's important to bear that in mind as well. So the next point is how much of the outcomes actually occur, right? So we started by saying what are the outcomes, but then you have to say, okay, but how much are we achieving? And here, very often, there is an obsession just with scale, right? So very often people say, 1 million is a magic number. We want to reach 1 million people in 5 years. And I think that's great, but it's important to bear in mind that's just one of the dimensions that matters. In particular, I'm calling it the breadth of impact. But you also have to say, well, if you're serving 1 million people, how much are you really changing the life of each person? And yes, if you can change the lives of 1 million people to some extent, that's power to you. It's a little bit like an area of a rectangle. The area of the rectangle is huge. But another way to have that area of that rectangle big is to say, okay, maybe I can't reach 1 million. Maybe I'll reach 10,000. Maybe I'll reach only 1,000. Maybe even 100. But I'm going to change their lives so completely. And you know, they will have so much better life. They're coming out of really harsh circumstances in life. That impact is also huge. So the point again is, on the one hand, scale is important, but it's not just about scale. It's also about saying how much difference are you making in each of those cases. And of course, one of the positive sides of business models is this third dimension, which is to the extent that you can achieve something by, rather than just giving it as a grant, you can achieve that by giving as an investment, then the same money rolls over again and again and again, and you can have impact for a much longer term. And this was the rationale behind investing CSR money in social impact bonds, for example, a conversation that we were having yesterday. So to the extent that there isn't a compromise on the other dimensions and you can achieve that would be a great outcome. To the extent that there's tensions that, you know, achieving that comes at the cost of depth or breadth of impact, you then have to evaluate what are the trade-offs, and as an organization and as a leader, what trade-offs are you willing to make? And obviously, once you start asking the question of how much of the outcomes are occurring, measurement becomes super critical, right? So, and one of the examples here is the annual ASA reports that Pratham has started a few years ago, which have done enormous favor to our understanding of what are the real issues in stopping children in India from learning, and then design outcomes for designing programs, for example, teaching at the right level, which are very cost effective in addressing those. So you're not designing programs in a vacuum, you're measuring outcomes. You're measuring outcomes before you do the program to understand the reality, and then you're measuring outcomes after to see have you really achieved what you set out to achieve. And related to that point is what is really your unique contribution, right? So impact is not just the outcomes you're achieving. Impact is about asking, hey, we are achieving certain outcomes, and certain other outcomes would have been achieved if we didn't come in anyway. You know, maybe I'm showing up in a state with my educational programs, and there are 5 other NGOs operating there. So the question then is, what do I as the 6th NGO bring in? And if I didn't go in there, would the outcomes really be that much different just with the other 5 NGOs that are already running their program. So the impact again is the delta in the outcomes rather than just the outcomes. And here's an example of an organization that is very diligent about taking that point of view and measuring, which is One Acre Fund in Eastern Africa, which is they serve smallholder farmers. They have a microfinance model, but it's combined with other interventions like connecting people to market, providing smallholder farmers with warehousing services, and educating them on farming techniques and so on. And they are very careful about saying, okay, we are measuring how much income has improved for the farmers that we serve, but we also need to go and understand how much are farmer incomes improving anyway. Maybe, this year the weather was better. Maybe there is some government policy being rolled out. Maybe there are other organizations operating in the region. So again, the focus is on delta. It's not about the $387 in income that my farmers were able to achieve. It's about saying that the farmers I serve achieved 387, but similar farmers without my program achieved 250. So I'm going to take credit for the 137 increase here and not the entire $387 in income. Now, this is just the impact itself, but then there's the issue of cost effectiveness of impact, which is it worth the cost of the intervention? And here, a lot of people are literally trying to translate into, for every dollar I get in, how much dollar benefit do I generate? And a lot of these research studies then form the basis for design of instruments like social impact bonds, especially in the space of prevention of undesirable outcomes. So this picture is about a classic case study in the context of preschool education, inclusive preschools in the US, where they said investing in preschools in African American communities helps kids, even up outcomes at the schooling level, and then ultimately also leads to favorable outcomes like reduction in social expenditures on these kids, greater tax revenues, and in the US context, what is very important is lower crime. And there's a dollar value you can put to that crime. And so they come up with a number, and different studies will give you a different number, but there's a range for every dollar that you put in preschool education, high quality preschool education for disadvantaged kids in the US. Different studies put the numbers at somewhere between $6, $7, $10, $12, $15 per kid return to society for every dollar that you're investing in. So you're able to, in a way, make a business case. And then that business case becomes the basis for you to say, look, here's the opportunity for a fantastic investment that is not happening. And that's not happening because the government doesn't have the money. So what we need some outcome funders who would come in and provide first of all, the working capital, so that then when the time comes, the government says, okay, I've saved so much, I can give you a part of that slice, and I get to keep the rest. And if I don't save anything, I'm not going to pay you back. And so the last point I want to go into from the impact management project is this notion of risk, which was the fifth dimension, and in particular, risk of unintended consequences. So this is an example that I very often teach. It's a classic case study in the development space. It was a social enterprise called Play Pump. And the whole idea was they installed about 1,000 of these devices in villages across 8 different countries in the southern part of Africa, starting with South Africa. And the idea was, we'll build in a pump, which also has a merry-go-round. So the kids, circle around and the water pumps out. But nobody bothered to say, hey, does it really work in reality? Does the community want it? Are we going to monitor how the performance is? Is it cost effective and all of that? And they got a lot of initial funding, and there was this sense that this is sustainable because we will put advertisements on the billboard, and the revenues from the advertisements is going to pay for it. But the reality was it led to a lot of issues, including, there was a UNICEF report that highlighted even child labor, which is these pumps were actually not as efficient in terms of serving a large community of, let's say, 2,500 people. So it literally required hours and hours of children playing. And it turns out, yes, the children like to play for the first 15 minutes, 30 minutes, but they don't want to play, and certainly my children don't, and I don't see any reason these kids would want to play for hours and hours simply because somebody wants them to be playing. And then there were other issues as well, because the incentives were all around installation, not around maintenance. Companies didn't really want to advertise in rural areas. This is a 4 or 5 times more expensive gadget than just a simple play pump, which is tried and tested, which has local ecosystems. People know how it works. People know how to repair it and all of that. So this was a spectacular disaster after having raised $16 million, and it was projected to go to 4,000 pumps and $60 million. And then, the whole thing completely imploded. Another example, and this is slightly more subtle, is the research and the criticism around fair trade, right? So in principle, fair trade is great. This is about doing a certification in which you're just saying the company you're buying from is paying farmers slightly above market wage rates. So it's a little bit more fair. But the important thing, again, and this is not to say we shouldn't be doing fair trade, but the important thing here is to recognize that there has been some unintended consequences which need to be managed. For example, it's usually the richer farmers in Latin America typically that were much more plugged into the fair trade network. They got certified, and a lot of the business therefore moved from the poorer farmers in Africa who were growing, let's say, cocoa beans or coffee beans to slightly richer, still poor, but slightly richer farmers in Latin America. So if you just look at the farmers that are a part of the fair trade, you might say, they're benefiting. But if you look at the bigger picture, you realize that in the process, you're harming certain other farmers, perhaps farmers that are even more vulnerable. And then the question you should be asking at a minimum is, can I do anything to minimize that unintended consequence there? One last example just from the environmental space on this, which is, it has become a very hot thing to do these days to come up with, products that are environmentally friendly. They've been made with recycled materials and all of that. And I think on the whole, that's a fantastic trend. But again, there's an unintended consequence that you really need to look at here. So if you're selling your next collection of clothing from recycled materials, the key question is, when somebody buys that piece of clothing, do they buy less of the environmentally less friendly material, right? So because if they're still buying all of the stuff they were buying already and all the environmental damage is still happening, then you really haven't achieved that much impact by additionally starting to sell them even more stuff, right? Because on the whole, it's not improving the situation around the environmental challenges that we face today. So if I have to just summarize these 5 points that I elaborated on, and in a way put it all in one picture, I would say it's about starting with a problem, keeping an eye on the outcomes, having a very clear theory of change on how you're getting at the outcomes, but then realizing that impact is not just the outcomes, but the difference between what is happening and what would have happened anyway. And but importantly, the net impact is about the impact that you intended minus the unintended impact that you might end up doing. So in the end, whenever you're having a conversation about impact, it's useful to have this sort of big picture in mind and see how this relates to anything that you're trying to do back on the impact space.